Continuing where I left off, Chapter 3 of Book 2. On returning from the review, Kutuzov took the Austrian general into his private room, and, calling his adjutant, asked for certain papers relating to the condition of the newly arrived troops and the letters that had come from Archduke Ferdinand, who was in command of the advanced army. Prince Andrei Bolkonsky came in with the required papers. Kutuzov and the Austrian member of the Hofkriegsrat were sitting at a table on which a plan was spread out. "Ah," murmured Kutuzov, glancing up, then going on with what he was saying in French, as if by this exclamation he had asked the adjutant to wait. "I have only one thing to say, General," said Kutuzov with a pleasing elegance of expression and intonation that compelled one to listen to each deliberately articulated word. Clearly he enjoyed the sound of his own voice. "I have only one thing to say, which is that if the matter depended on my personal wishes, the desire of His Majesty, Emperor Franz, would have been fulfilled long ago. I should long since have joined the Archduke, and, believe me, on my honor, for me, personally, it would have been most gratifying to hand over the supreme command of the army to a better informed and more skillful general, of whom Austria has such an abundance, and to unburden myself of all this weighty responsibility. But circumstances are sometimes too strong for us, General." And Kutuzov smiled in a way that seemed to say, "You have a perfect right not to believe me, and it is a matter of complete indifference to me whether you do or not, but you have no cause to tell me so, and that is the whole point." The Austrian general looked dissatisfied, but he had no choice but to answer Kutuzov in the same vein. "On the contrary," he said, in a querulous, angry tone that contradicted the flattery conveyed by his words, "on the contrary, the participation of your Excellency in the common action is highly valued by His Majesty. But we believe that the present delay is depriving the splendid Russian troops and their commander-in-chief of the laurels they have been accustomed to win in battles," he concluded with an obviously prepared phrase. Kutuzov bowed, his smile unchanged. "But such is my conviction," he said, "and, judging by the last letter with which His Highness the Archduke Ferdinand honored me, I assume that the Austrian troops, under the command of so able a leader as General Mack, have by now won a decisive victory, and are no longer in need of our aid." The general frowned. Though there was no definite news of the Austrian defeat, there were a great many circumstances confirming the unfavorable rumors. As a consequence, Kutuzov's assumption of an Austrian victory sounded very much like sarcasm. But Kutuzov continued to smile blandly, still with an expression that seemed to say that he had a right to make such an assumption, and, in fact, the last letter he had received from Mack's army did inform him of a victory, and stated that strategically the army's position was most advantageous. "Let me have that letter," said Kutuzov, turning to Prince Andrei. "Now, if you will be so good as to look at this," and with an ironic smile playing about the corners of his mouth, he read in German to the Austrian general the following passage from the Archduke Ferdinand's letter. We have fully concentrated forces of nearly 70,000 men with which to attack and defeat the enemy should he cross the Lech. As we are already in control of the Ohm, we should not fail to maintain our advantage by also controlling both sides of the Danube, so that in the event that the enemy does not cross the Lech, we can instantly assault his lines of communication, recross the Danube lower down, and thwart his intentions should he decide to direct his whole force against our faithful ally. Accordingly, we shall confidently await the moment when the Imperial Russian army is fully equipped, at which time we shall have no difficulty in conjointly finding a way to prepare for the enemy the fate he deserves. When he came to the end of the sentence, Kutuzov sighed heavily and directed an affable, attentive look at the member of the Hofkriegsrat. But, Your Excellency, you know the wise precept in joining us to expect the worst, said the Austrian general, evidently wishing to have done with jests and to get down to business. He cast a disgruntled look at the adjutant. Excuse me, General, interrupted Kutuzov, also turning to Prince Andrei. Look here, my dear boy. Get all the reports of our scouts from Koloskovy. Here are 2 letters from Count Nostitz. Here is a letter from the Archduke Ferdinand. And here are these, he said, handing him several papers. Make a concise memorandum in French out of all of this, showing all the information we have had of the movements of the Austrian army. Then give it to His Excellency. Prince Andrei bowed his head, indicating that from the first word he understood not only what was said, but also what Kutuzov would have liked to say to him. He gathered up the papers, and, with a bow that included both men, moved quietly over the carpeted floor and out of the waiting room. Though not much time had passed since Prince Andrei had left Russia, he had greatly changed during that period. In the expression of his face, his gestures, his walk, there was scarcely a trace of his former affectation, lassitude, and indolence. He had the look of a man who has no time to think of the impression he is making on others, and who is occupied with agreeable and interesting work. His face expressed greater satisfaction with himself and those around him. His smile and glance were brighter, more attractive. Kutuzov, whom he had joined in Poland, had received him very cordially, promised not to forget him, distinguished him above other adjutants, and had taken him with him to Vienna and entrusted with him with the more serious commissions. From Vienna, Kutuzov wrote to his old comrade, Prince Andrei's father. Your son gives promise of becoming an outstanding officer by virtue of his ability, industry, and strength of character. I consider myself fortunate to have such a subordinate. Among his fellow officers on Kutuzov's staff and in the army generally, Prince Andrei had 2 quite contradictory reputations, just as he had had in Petersburg society. Some of the officers, a minority, regarded him as being different from themselves and everyone else, expected great things of him, listened to him, admired and imitated him. With him he was natural and pleasant. Others, the majority, disliked him and considered him a cold, conceited, disagreeable man. But among them Prince Andrei assumed an imposing attitude that made him respected and even feared. Coming out of Kutuzov's room with the papers in his hand, Prince Andrei went up to the duty adjutant in the waiting room. His comrade Kalazovsky, who was sitting at the window with a book. Well, what is it, Prince? I have been told to make a memorandum of the reasons why we are not advancing. And why aren't we? Prince Andrei shrugged his shoulders. No news from Mack? Asked Kozlovsky. No. If it were true that he had been defeated, We should have heard. Probably, said Prince Andrei, going toward the outer door. At that moment, a tall Austrian general, his head bound with a black handkerchief, wearing a frock coat with the Order of Maria Theresa on it, hastily entered, slamming the door. Prince Andrei stopped short. Commander-in-Chief Kutzevol? The general quickly inquired, speaking with a harsh German accent and looking from side to side as he advanced, without pausing, straight to the door of Kutuzov's private room. The commander-in-chief is engaged, said Kalusky, hurriedly going to the unknown general and blocking his way. Whom shall I announce? The general's face clouded. His lips twitched and quivered. He took out a notebook, quickly scribbled something in pencil, tore out the leaf, handed it to Kalusky, and went rapidly to the window, where he flung himself into a chair and looked at the officers as if to say, Why are you staring at me? Then he lifted his head, craned his neck as if about to say something, and with affected indifference began to hum under his breath, producing an odd sound that instantly broke off. The door to the private room opened, and Kutuzov appeared on the threshold. The general, with the bandaged head, went up to Kutuzov as though fleeing some danger, his body bent forward and his thin legs making long, rapid strides. You see, before you, the unfortunate Mac, he said in French, his voice breaking. For a moment, Kutuzov's face, as he stood in the doorway, remained absolutely impassive. Then the wrinkles ripped over his face like a wave, leaving his forehead smooth again. He closed his eyes, respectfully bowed his head, and without a word let Mac into the room without him, shutting the door himself. The rumor that had been circulating about the defeat of the Austrians and the capitulation of the whole army at Ulm turned out to be true. Within half an hour, adjutants had been dispatched in all directions with orders specifying that the Russian troops, hitherto inactive, were shortly to confront the enemy. Prince Andrei was one of those rare staff officers whose chief interest laid in the general progress of the war. Seeing Mac and learning the details of his route, he realized that half the Russian campaign was lost. He perceived all the difficulties of the Russian army's position, vividly imagined what lay before it, as well as the part he himself would have to play. He could not help feeling a thrill of joy at the thought of arrogant Austrians' humiliation, and that within a week he might see and take part in the Russian army's first encounter with the French since Suvorov's day. And while he feared that Bonaparte's genius might outweigh all the valor of the Russian troops, at the same time he could not bear the thought of his hero's disgrace. Excited and vexed by these thoughts, Prince Andrei went to his room to write a letter to his father, which he did every day. In the corridor he met Nevezisky, with whom he shared a room, and the war Zherkov. They were laughing as usual. Why so glum? asked Nevezisky, noticing Prince Andrei's pale face and glittering eyes. There is no cause for merriment, reported Balkovsky. Just as Prince Andrei met Nevezisky and Zherkov, there appeared coming toward them from the other end of the corridor Strauch, an Australian general attached to Kutuzov's staff to oversee the provisioning of the Russian army, and the member of the Hofkriegsrat who had arrived the previous evening. There was ample room in the wide corridor for the generals to pass the three officers without difficulty. But Zherkov, pushing Nevezisky to one side, breathlessly exclaimed, "They're coming! They're coming! Step aside! Please make way!" As the generals passed, looking as if they wanted to avoid any troublesome attentions, Zherkov's face broke into a silly grin, which he seemed unable to suppress. "Your Excellency," as he said in German, stepping forward and addressing the Austrian general, "I have the honor to congratulate you." He bowed awkwardly, scraping first with one foot, then the other, like a child in dancing school. The member of the Hofkriegsrat surveyed him austerely, but seeing the seriousness of his inane smile, could not refuse him a moment's attention. "I have the honor to congratulate you, General. General Mack has arrived. He is quite well. Only a little bruised up here," he added, pointing to his head and beaming. The general frowned, turned away, and walked on. "Gut, we've naive," he exclaimed angrily, after he had gone a few steps. Nevsky laughed boisterously and threw his arms around Prince Andrei, but Balsky, growing still paler, pushed him away with a look of fury and turned to Zherkov. The nervous irritation aroused in him by the sight of Mack, the news of his defeat, and his thoughts of what now lay before the Russian army, found a vent in his anger at Zherkov's jest. "If, sir, you choose to be a clown," he said sharply, his jaw trembling slightly, "I cannot stop you. But I warn you, if you ever again dare to play the fool in my presence, I will teach you how to behave yourself." Nevsky and Zherkov were so amazed at this outburst that they gazed at Bolkonsky in wide-eyed silence. "Well, I only congratulated them," said Zherkov. "I am not jesting with you. Please be silent," cried Bolkonsky, and taking Nevsky by arm, he walked away from Zherkov and was at loss for words. "Come now, my friend, what's the matter with you?" said Nevsky smoothly. "What's the matter?" exclaimed Prince Andrei, so agitated that he stopped walking. "Can't you understand? Either we are officers, serving our Tsar and our fatherland, rejoicing in the success and deploring the misfortunes of our common cause, or we are lackeys, with no interest in our master's affairs. 40,000 men massacred, our ally army destroyed, and if you find this a cause for jesting," he said, reverting to French, as if to give force to his opinion, "it's all very well for a worthless puppy like the individual you've made a friend of, but not for you, not for you. Only a street urchin would amuse himself in such a way," he added in Russian. But, having noticed that Zherkov could still hear him, he pronounced the words with a French accent. He waited for a moment to see whether the cornet would make some reply, but Zherkov turned and left the corridor. Chapter 4, Book 2. The Pavlograd Hussars were stationed 2 miles from Branu. The squadron in which Nikolai Rostov was serving as a cadet was quartered in the German village of Salzenek. The best quarters in the village were assigned to the squadron commander, Captain Denisov, known throughout the entire cavalry division as Vaska Denisov. Cadet Rostov had been sharing his quarters ever since joining the regiment in Poland. On the 8th of October, the day when at headquarters all was in turmoil over the news of Mack's defeat, the camp life of the officers in this squadron were quietly proceeding as usual. When Rostov rode back from a foraging expedition early in the morning, Denisov, who had been losing at cards all night, had not yet returned. Rostov, in his cadet's uniform, rode up to the steps, and, reining in his horse, swung his leg over with a supple, youthful movement, paused a moment in the stirrup as if loath to part from his horse, then jumped down and called an orderly. "Ah, Bondarenko, my dear friend," he said to the hussar who rushed up to the horse. "Walk him, my dear fellow," he said, with that blithe, warm friendliness with which good-hearted young people treat everyone when they are happy. "Yes, your excellency," replied the Ukrainian, cheerfully nodding his head. "See that you walk him properly." Another hussar came running up to the horse, but Bondarenko had already thrown the reins of the snaffle bit over the horse's head. It was obvious that the cadet was liberal with tips and that it paid to serve him. Rostov lingered on the steps, stroking the horse's neck and crupper. "Splendid! What a horse he will be," he said to himself, with a smile, and holding his saber, his spurs jingling, he ran up the steps of the porch. His German landlord, pitchfork in hand, wearing a peak cap and jerkin, looked out of the cowshed, where he was clearing out manure. His face immediately brightened on seeing Rostov. He smiled good-humoredly and winked. "Schön gut morgen, schön gut morgen," he said, apparently taking pleasure in greeting the young man. "At work already?" asked Rostov in German, his eager face still wearing the same joyous, friendly smile. "Hurrah for the Austrians! Hurrah for the Russians! Hurrah for the Emperor Alexander!" he cried, repeating the phrases often spoken by the German landlord. The German laughed, and, coming out of the cowshed, pulled off his cap and waved it above his head, shouting, "Hooray for the whole world!" Though neither the German cleaning his cowshed, nor Rostov, who had been out foraging for hay with his platoon, had any special reason for rejoicing, they looked at each other with brotherly love and absolute delight, wagging their heads in token of their mutual affection, and parting with smiles, the German going back to his cowshed, and Rostov to the cottage he shared with Denisov. "Where's your master?" he asked Lavrushka, Denisov's orderly, whom all the regiment knew for a rogue. "Hasn't been in since evening. Must have been losing," replied Lavrushka. "By now I know, if he wins, he comes back early to brag about it. But if he's not here by morning, it means he's lost. He'll come back in a rage. Do you want some coffee?" "Yes, and be quick." 10 minutes later, Lavrushka brought the coffee. "Here he comes," he said. "Now for trouble." Rostov looked out the window and saw Denisov coming home. Denisov was a small, red-faced man with a sparkling black eyes, tousled black hair, and mustache. He wore a hussar's cloak, which was unfastened, wide, sagging breeches, and a crumpled shako on the back of his head. He came up to the porch gloomily with hanging head. "Lavrushka," he shouted in a loud, angry voice. "Well, take it off, you blockhead." Lavrushka replied, Up already," said Deniskov, coming into the room. "Long ago," said Rostov. I already been for the hay, and have been seen Fraulein Mathilda." "Really? And I've been losing, brother. Lost like a son of a bitch last night," shouted Denisov, who never pronounced an "er." "What luck! What rotten luck! It began as soon as you left, and just kept on like that. Hey, T!" Screwing up his face and showing his short, strong teeth as if he were grinning, he began with the stubby fingers of both hands to ruffle his thick black hair, which was tangled as a forest. "What devil made me go to that wat?" "An officer nicknamed the Rat," he said, rubbing his forehead and face with both hands. "Can you imagine? Not a single card, not one did he give me." He took the lighted pipe that was handed to him, gripped it in his fist, and scattering sparks as he banged it on the floor, continued to shout. "He lets you win the singles, then beats you when they're doubled. Gives you the singles and takes the doubles." He kept scattering sparks, smashed the pipe, and threw it away. After remaining silent for a moment, he suddenly looked up at Rostov, his black eyes sparkling merrily, and said, "If at least we had some women here. As it is, there's nothing to do but drink. If only the fighting would begin soon. Hey, who's there?" he cried, turning as the sound of heavy boots and jingling spurs came to a stop outside the door, and a respectful cough was heard. "The quartermaster," said Lavrushka. Denisov's frown deepened. "Beastly," he muttered, flinging down a purse with a few gold pieces in it. "Wustov, count it, my dear boy. See how much is left, and shove it under the pillow," he said, and went out to the quartermaster. Rostov took the money, mechanically stacked the old and new coins in separate piles, and began counting them. "Ah, Talian, good morning. They cleaned me out last night," Denisov was heard saying in the next room. "Where? At Bakov's, at the Rats?" "I knew it," replied a piping voice, as Lieutenant Telianin, a small man in the same squadron, came into the room. Rostov flung the purse under a pillow and shook the moist little hand that was held out to him. Telianin, for some reason, had been transferred from the Guards just before the campaign. He conducted himself very well in the regiment, but was not liked, and Rostov in particular was able was unable to overcome or conceal his groundless apathy for this officer. "Well, young cavalryman, how is my rook working out for you?" he asked. Rook was the young horse Telyanin had sold to Rostov. The lieutenant never looked a man in the eye when talking to him. His eyes continually wandered from one object to another. "I saw you riding this morning." "Oh, he's all right, a good horse," answered Rostov, though the horse was not worth half the 700 rubles he had paid for him. "He's begun to go a little lame in the left foreleg," he added. "The hoof's cracked. That's nothing. I'll teach you. I'll show you what kind of nail to use." "Please do," said Rostov. I'll show you. It's no secret, and you'll thank me for the horse." "Then I'll have the horses brought round," said Rostov, anxious to get rid of Telyanin, and he went out to give the order. In the entry, Denisov sat hunched over a pipe, facing the quartermaster, who was giving him some sort of report. Seeing Rostov, he screwed up his face and pointed over his shoulder with his thumb to the room where Telyanin was sitting, and gave a shudder of disgust. "Ah, I don't like that fellow," he said, heedless of the quartermaster's presence. Rostov shrugged his shoulders as if to say, "Nor do I, but what can one do?" After giving his order, he returned to Telyanin. Telyanin was sitting in the same indolent posture in which Rostov had left him, rubbing his small white hands together. "Some people really are obnoxious," thought Rostov as he entered the room. "Well, did you tell them to bring the horse?" asked Telyanin, getting up and casually glancing about the room. "I did." "Then let's go along. I only dropped in to ask Denisov about yesterday's order. Have you received Denisov?" "Not yet. Where are you off to?" "I want to teach this young man how to shoe a horse," said Telyanin. They crossed the porch and went out to the stable. The lieutenant showed Rostov how to nail the shoe and went off to his own quarters. Well, Rostov returned. There was a bottle of vodka and a sausage on the table at which Denisov was sitting, with a sheet of paper before him, scratching away with his pen. He gazed somberly into Rostov's face. "Am I witting to her?" he said. Leaning his elbows on the table, pen in hand, he was obviously delighted to have the opportunity of saying, this being quicker than writing, all he intended to put in the letter. "You see, my friend," he said, "when we do not love, we sleep. We are the children of dust. But fall in love, and you are a god, pure as on the first day of creation. Now who's coming?" "Tell him to go to hell. I'm busy," he shouted to Larushka, who came up to him quite undaunted. "Who should it be? You yourself sent for him? The quartermaster's come for the money." Denisov frowned and was about to shout something, but refrained. "Beastly business," he muttered under his breath. "How much money is left in the purse?" he asked Rostov. 7 new and 3 old imperials." "Ah, beastly. Well, what are you standing there for, you dummy? Go and get him," he shouted to Larushka. "Please, Denisov, let me lend you some money. I have some, you know," said Rostov, blushing. "I don't like borrowing from friends. Don't like it at all," said Denisov. "But if you don't take it from me as a comrade, I'll be offended." "Really, have it," Rostov repeated. "No, I tell you." Denisov went to the bed to get the purse from under the pillow. "Where did you put it, Rostov?" "Under the bottom pillow." "But it's not there." "But it's not here." Denisov threw pillows on the floor. The purse was not there. "That's very odd." "Wait, haven't you dropped it?" asked Rostov, picking up the pillows one at a time and shaking them. He pulled off the quilt and shook it. The purse was not there. "Can I have forgotten?" "No. I remember thinking that you kept it under your head like buried treasure," said Rostov. "I put it right here." "Where is it?" he asked, turning to Larushka. "I wasn't in the room. It must be right where you put it." "But it isn't." "That's just like you. You're always throwing things down somewhere and forgetting them. Look in your pockets." "No, if I hadn't thought about the buried treasure," said Rostov. "But I remember putting it there." Larushka rummaged through all the bedding, looked under the bed, under the table, and after ransacking everything stood stock still in the middle of the room. Denisov followed all his movements in silence. And when Lavrashka threw up his hands in perplexity, Denisov looked at Rostov. Rostov, none of your schoolboy twicks. Rostov felt Denis's eyes on him, looked up, and instantly averted his gaze. All the blood which had seemed to be congested just below his throat rushed to his face and eyes. He was unable to draw a breath. There hasn't been anyone in the room except the lieutenant and yourselves. It must be here somewhere, said Lavrashka. Now then, you devil's puppet, bestir yourself and look for it. Denisov suddenly shouted, turning purple and rushing at the orderly with a threatening gesture. If that purse isn't found, I'll beat you black and blue. I'll beat you, all of you. Avoiding Denisov's eyes, Rostov commenced buttoning his jacket, then buckled on his saber and put on his cap. I'll tell you, the purse must be found, shouted Denisov, shaking the orderly by the shoulders and knocking him against the wall. Denisov let him alone. I know who took it, said Rostov, going to the door without raising his eyes. Denisov stopped, thought for a moment, and, realizing what Rostov had implied, seized him by the arm. That's absurd, he roared, so that the veins of his neck and forehead stood out like cords. You've gone out of your mind, I tell you. I won't allow it. The purse is here. I'll flay this scoundrel alive and it will be found. I know who took it, repeated Rostov unsteadily as he went to the door. And I tell you, don't you dare do that, shouted Denisov, rushing toward the cadet to hold him back. But Rostov pulled his arm away and looked Denisov straight in the face, as incensed and resolute as if he were his worst enemy. Do you realize what you are saying? He asked in a trembling voice. There was no one else in the room except me, so if it was not, then... He was unable to finish and ran out the room. Oh, damn you! Damn all of you! Were the last words Rostov heard. Rostov went to Telyan's quarters. The master's not in. He's gone to headquarters, Telyan's orderly said to him. Has anything happened? He asked, astonished at the cadet's distraught expression. No, nothing. You've only just missed him, said the orderly. Staff headquarters were 3 versts from Salznik, without going back to the cottage. Rostov took a horse and rode there. In the village there was a tavern frequented by the officers. As Rostov approached it, he saw Telyan's horse near the entrance. In the second room of the tavern, the lieutenant was sitting at a table with a plate of sausage and a bottle of wine in front of him. Ah, so you've come here too, young man, he said, smiling and raising his eyebrows. Yes, said Rostov, as if it cost him a great effort to utter the word. He sat down at the next table. Both men were silent. There were 2 Germans and a Russian officer in the room. No one spoke, and nothing was heard but the lieutenant's munching and the clatter of knives on plates. When Telyan had finished his lunch, he took out his pocket, a double purse, drew the rings apart with his small white curved fingers, took out a gold imperial, and raising his eyebrows, gave it to the waiter. Please be quick, he said. The coin was a new one. Rostov stood up and went to Telyan. Allow me to look at that purse, he said in a low, almost inaudible voice. With a shifty glance, his eyebrows still raised, Telyan handed him the purse. Yes, it's a nice little purse. Yes, he said, and suddenly grew pale. Have a look at it, young man, he added. Rostov took the purse, examined it, looked at the money in it, then looked at Telyan. The lieutenant's gaze was wondering, as usual, and all at once he became very jovial. When we're in Vienna, I'll leave it all there. But in these filthy little towns, there's no place to spend it, he said. Come, let me have it, young man. I'm going. Rostov said nothing. And you, going to have lunch too? They feed you quite decently here, continued Telyanin. Well, give it to me. He held out his hand and took the purse. Rostov let go of it. Having taken it, Telyan started to put it in the pocket of his riding breeches. His eyebrows nonchalantly raised, his mouth half open as if to say, Yes, I'm putting my purse in my pocket, which is a very simple matter, and no one's business but your own. Well, young man, he said with a sigh, looking into Rostov's eyes from under his raised brows. A glint Like an electric spark flashed from Telyon's eyes to Rostov, passing back and forth several times, all in an instant. "Come here," said Rostov, seizing Telyan by the arm and almost dragging him to the window. "That is Denisov's money. You took it," he whispered in his ear. "What? What? How dare you? What?" babbled Telyan. But the words came out like a piteous, despairing cry and a plea for pardon. As soon as Rostov heard the sound of his voice, his soul was relieved of a tremendous load of doubt. He felt glad, yet instantly began to pity the unfortunate man who stood before him. Nevertheless, he had to finish what he had begun. "God knows what people here may think," muttered Telyan, and snatching up his cap and moving toward the small empty room. "You owe me an explanation." "I know it, and I shall prove it," said Rostov. "I—" Every muscle of Telyan's pale, intimidated face began to quiver. His gaze still shifted, never rising to the level of Rostov's face, and he sobbed audibly. "Count Rostov, don't ruin a young man. Here's the wretched money. Take it." He threw the money on the table. "I have an old father, a mother." Rostov took the money, and avoiding Telyan's eyes, went out without a word. But when he reached the door, he stopped and turned back. "My God," he said, with tears in his eyes, "how could you do it?" "Count," said Telyan, coming nearer to him. "Don't touch me," said Rostov, drawing back. "If you need the money, take it." He flung the purse at him and ran out of the tavern. And I'm going to leave it off there. I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and please give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Leave a comment below or subscribe. And you don't have to do anything. Just keep looking at the videos, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.